Pretty much since I started climbing 11 years ago, I have been obsessed with figuring out how I can improve as a climber. And I think I may have found a test that can finally begin to address some of the strengths and weaknesses in my climbing so I can start to see some really big improvements on the wall. It's called the Remote Climbing Assessment from Lattice, and it is by far the most comprehensive climbing exam I've ever seen. It takes over 3 days to complete and involves 20 different exercises that you're measured against. Now, I just completed this test, and I also hopped on the phone with Josh Hadley, the Lattice climbing coach you see in many of their YouTube videos, to give me an inside scoop on what to expect from this training assessment.
So when you look at finger strength, that correlates really well with climbing performance. When we look at pull-up strength, again, we might assume that's like a really good measure. It's actually a pretty poor correlation with climbing performance.
Most climbers, myself included, will hit a plateau at some point in their climbing journey. I imagine this is the moment where your natural abilities might not cut it anymore and you'll see significantly diminished returns on the wall. It's the moment when the advice, just climb more, might not cut it anymore. My approach, whenever I've hit this sort of plateau, is to experiment with new training methods. Worked pretty well. I've tried implementing hangboarding into my climbing routine. I've tried max hangs or weighted hangs. I've tried campus boarding, board climbing like on the moon board or tension board. I've tried doing more core, training different grip types like the open hand crimp or the half crimp, but nothing has really advanced my climbing progress significantly since I hit that plateau all that time ago. It's starting to feel like I'm just spinning a wheel and hoping I land on something that'll magically make me climb a couple grades harder. And I felt this way until I learned about the Remote Climbing Assessment from Lattice. When I first heard about the Lattice Training Assessment, I thought it might be a solution to this feeling of uncertainty I was having of choosing what I should improve or work on. So what is the Remote Climbing Assessment? Well, who better to explain this than an actual Lattice training coach, Josh.
We have kind of two levels of assessment. We have what we call an advanced assessment and an elite assessment. There's a really big range of tests, which will cover things like maximum strength, muscular endurance in the forearms and in the body as well. And then we're going to look at tests of flexibility as well. So we try and be quite holistic in that approach, but it's very much all focused on the physical attributes of a climber. It's not going to cover the technical or psychological aspects of rock climbing.
The Remote Climbing Assessment is a 3-day, 20 exercise test meant to showcase the physical aspects of climbing and tell you what your strengths and weaknesses are.
Can't touch your toes? You're in for a treat.
Weak core? This test will call you out.
This test gathers the data from how well you scored and compares it to their database of thousands of other climbers that have also taken the test.
At the start of the test, you input your current climbing grade and then your goal grade, and it compares your data to that of climbers who are already achieving that goal. It helps you get an idea of, hey, maybe your finger strength is lacking because people who can climb 7A or whatever the mark might be, their finger strength is this much. As far as what inspired the Lattice Training Assessment, well, it got its inspiration from other sports.
The inspiration for assessments within any sporting context comes from outside of climbing. It was not born within climbing. It's been done for decades in other sports. I think we've always been particularly interested on how the energy systems interact and the capacity to do work within those energy systems. And a lot of that stuff came from like running and cycling. In fact, like the first time I met Tom and I was talking about the assessments I was running in my dissertation degree level, he handed me a book about swimming and developing anaerobic capacity, and he was like, read this book and then come back to me and we'll start talking about energy systems. It's always come from like other sports. The critical force test you'll have seen on our YouTube channel that we've done with like Stefano and Emil, and we've done this loads within our own kind of coaching practice here in Sheffield. Like that came from running and cycling. In fact, like the idea of critical force actually goes back decades and decades.
And it's over. It's over.
Oh, it's over. Okay, nice. My heart. Right arm is destroyed.
And because this test is called the Remote Climbing Assessment, Lattice wanted to make it as accessible as possible. All you need is access to a hangboard, some weights, something to hang those weights off of like a climbing harness, and then maybe a mat for the push-ups and stretching, and a pull-up bar.
But we're talking about an assessment here, which you can do on your own with the absence of a coach. Like I said earlier, that this assessment is supposed to be really accessible. And so, yes, there's probably things which would be termed more valid for climbing, like a more valid test for climbing. But we have to find a balance between something that like I can write down in a short instruction, you can take into the climbing gym, you can do it in half an hour, and then like get some sort of feedback from that.
And let me quickly say, this video isn't sponsored by Lattice in any sort of way. I just thought the test was interesting. At the end of the video, I'm gonna go over some drawbacks that I found with Lattice's test. I found myself particularly drawn to this test because of how all-encompassing it seemed to be. A couple of years ago, a different climbing test absolutely blew up the internet, created by two climbers, Stian Kristoffersen and Martin Mobraten, called the 9C strength test. This test had every big YouTuber trying their hand at their test. Similar to the Lattice remote climbing assessment, you were tested on things like max hangs, pull-ups, and endurance. It then gave you points based on how you scored and told you roughly how hard you should be climbing. It only tested you on 4 different exercises: max added weight to your body weight from a 20 mil edge or a max hang, max pull-up weight from just a standard pull-up bar, adding weight, L-sit progression or front levers, and last, how long you can hang on a pull-up bar. The cool part about the 9C strength test was that it added up your scores on a scale of 1 to 40 and told you roughly how hard you should be climbing. Now, this test certainly had its drawbacks. I think most test takers knew that if they scored 9C on this test, they weren't about to go send Silence and Flattinger next month. But compared to the 9C strength test, the Lattice test is much more comprehensive. So how did the remote climbing assessment go for me? Let me just say, this assessment was really hard. There's a reason they want you to do it on 3 separate days, because if you were to pack this all into one single session, it would just be way too much on your fingers and your body. All in, the 20 exercises included in the remote climbing assessment are a 20mm edge max hang with weight, box split flexibility, shoulder engagement, forward bend flexibility, low row, flexibility knee to wall, push-ups or press-ups as Lattice calls them, what I call repeaters, Lattice calls aerobic/anaerobic profiling, which is a fingerboard endurance test, 7 seconds on, 3 seconds off on a 20 mil edge to failure. This was done at 50% of the weight of your max hang, 60% and 70%. 2 rep max pull-up with weight, I progression on rings, T progression on rings, lever lift on a pull-up bar, wall Superman flexibility, shoulder mobility flexibility, max quantity of body weight pull-ups, hollow body hold, plank, and side plank. That is quite the list of exercises, and I was so surprised at how sore I was after doing this every single day. I think particularly it showed that my core was a little bit weak. Because there's so many things you're testing, you could imagine this starts to paint a fairly comprehensive picture of how strong you actually are as a climber. Now, this is a lot of data for climbers to handle, and Josh had some thoughts with how climbers should interpret their data.
We offer consultations as well. So if you ever wanted to have a call and run through your assessment, that's easily a next step you need to do without ever committing to like coaching or actual training. I would say the value in interpreting it is about knowing how much weight to put into any test. There's like my ideal client scenario where I'm working with a climber and they've got a really specific goal. They've got like a boulder problem or a sport route they want to do. And we can review that and we can make a needs analysis for that specific goal. And so we can say, you want to climb a boulder problem, which has a really high demand on finger strength and core strength, but it's also meaning you're going to be on the wall for about 50 seconds. So we need a quite high level of like anaerobic capacity. That means I can go into any assessment and be like, okay, this is the needs analysis of your goal. This is where the assessment says you are at the minute. And that's a really easy way to interpret it. But it starts with having a needs analysis of what you want as a climber. The kind of other end of the spectrum is if you're a climber and you do an assessment because you kind of, just want to get better, then it's totally up to your interpretation of where you put the weight of that assessment, where you decide to put a focus in your training. And so it's quite easy in that scenario to just say, these are strengths, these are weaknesses, I'll train all of the weaknesses. But sometimes there's value of putting more effort into your strengths as well, right? I work with some like tall climbers that I know will always be much better at like wide compression moves because they have the height. They've got years of background climbing on sandstone. And sometimes I lean into developing their strengths just as much as their weaknesses, because like that gives them more enjoyment out of the whole sport. Like they go on climbing trips to Fontainebleau where they're climbing on like sandstone and stuff. And so we can lean into strengths just as much as weaknesses. And we have to decide at what point those weaknesses are going to improve your development in the sport and potentially just your enjoyment of the sport as well.
When I got my assessment results back, it said I had a pretty weak core, about average or above average finger strength, good power and strength, and then really poor flexibility. This is kind of what I expected because I don't really train core or flexibility when I go to the climbing gym. And it was pretty cool to see that my finger strength, when compared to other climbers that climb at my goal grade of 12B, I'm basically already there. And I could probably start projecting some 12Bs knowing that I have to work on things like my core and flexibility to give me that extra edge. In my conversation with Josh, he was hesitant to say any one parameter would give me that big jump when it comes to improving my climbing skill. He really wanted to stress that this was just a look at the physical aspects of climbing, and things like technique aren't really talked about or addressed in the Lattice remote assessment.
Let's say for finger strength, there's like a really good model behind it. And we can say, even though there's a large standard deviation, we can say that more tends to correlate better with your grade. So we can say whether you're performing well at the level of climbing you're at, or if you're above and below the mean of that data set. But when it comes to something like pull-up strength, generally we're going to say more is better if you're performing low on it. But at a certain point, you really don't want to waste your energy on that much more. And I think that's kind of what you tend to see with some of our core strength tests is like, we'll say what a good score is, but we won't go into anything more than that, because generally like you can reach a good level of core strength, but if you put any more effort into that, the law of diminishing returns arrives. And then really, we don't think that that's much more value to you as a rock climber. And you can definitely start focusing on other things.
He seemed to suggest that a fairly holistic approach and using something like a climbing coach would be a great next step to using this assessment. I think the difficult thing with that advice is that people are really drawn towards trying to do the least possible effort to see the most possible gains. And YouTubers, myself especially included, are guilty of this because we post videos like seeing what kind of climbing gains can happen from training on a hangboard twice a day, or using a grip trainer for a whole month, or whatever sort of 30-day challenge a YouTuber might suggest next month. But the reality is, for most climbers, it's going to take a lot of hard work if I'm going to want to see some actual improvements to the grades I climb. I think that's why people gravitate towards coaches in certain scenarios like this, because coaches are able to take this sort of data or see how you climb and give you a very pointed approach to how you should see gains, complete with a schedule that you can follow. Now, I really enjoyed my experience with taking the Lattice climbing assessment, but I do have to point out some drawbacks. When you finish the test, Lattice really sets you up to sign up for one of their coaching plans. Now, I don't think I'm going to sign up for one of these coaching plans because I would much rather meet with a coach in person, but their coaching plans are pretty expensive. And for somebody that may not be able to afford a coach or just don't want to have to deal with the hassle of meeting with a coach, this is just a lot of data to get dumped on. And that leads me to my second point. Lattice just kind of hands you the data and says, here, this is yours now. It doesn't give you much analysis as far as what those numbers might mean. I wish there was more analysis into things like shoulder flexibility. Like increasing my shoulder flexibility might see these differences on the climbing wall. Or improving things like my core might cause me to see these improvements to my climbing. Or same with pull-ups. What are pull-ups really going to do? Or what does my current level of pull-ups, what is that going to lead to on the climbing wall? And I think that's a lot to ask for Lattice to provide more analysis, but this climbing test isn't free. It is $30. And so I just wish there was a little bit more analysis from Lattice. I think the sad reality is most people that take this sort of assessment are probably just going to continue to climb as normal. As for my experience and my conversation with Josh, this test has left me feeling pretty optimistic. I think it's really pointed out some obvious weaknesses in my climbing, and I'm going to really spend the next couple of months to years working on these weaknesses. If you like this video, consider giving it a thumbs up and subscribing. Special shout out to Lattice for hopping on a call and giving me so much valuable insight about this test. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you next time.